On April 6, 1974, two married couples from Sweden took the stage together at the 19th annual Eurovision Song Contest. They began to play a song called Waterloo, which somehow used Napoleon's famous defeat as a metaphor for falling in love. And that is how most of the world met ABBA. And it was an auspicious beginning. Waterloo wound up winning that year's contest, leaving millions of new fans wondering what the band would do next. But after some follow-up singles failed to perform, they were starting to look like just another one-hit wonder. But ABBA wouldn't go away that easily. They kept at it, clawing their way back to the charts with songs like Mamma Mia and Fernando, and establishing themselves as, if nothing else, a respectable pop act for the European market. And then, on August 16, 1976, a new single dropped, and it dropped like an atomic bomb. It tore through the charts, hitting #1 in 16 different markets, and forever establishing ABBA as one of the greatest pop acts of all time. That single, of course, was Dancing Queen. Let's take it apart. Before we get started, if you want to see my next video a month early or just watch this one ad-free, those are both live now on Patreon. There's a link in the description, more on that at the end of the video. The song starts like this. And immediately, I want to talk about production. Part of the genius of ABBA was the way they fused traditional Europop sounds with new styles and techniques coming from America, and at the time, the big thing in American pop production was the wall of sound. Developed by convicted murderer Phil Spector, the wall of sound involved layer after layer of instruments, filling up the mix with a lush, delightful bounty of timbres. ABBA's producer, Michael Tretow, described the philosophy as trying to give as much music as possible for the money. And you can see that in Dancing Queen. Including the members of ABBA, the song features 23 musicians, playing not just the typical rock complement of guitar, bass, drums, but also piano, synthesizers, a second guitar, additional percussion, and, of course, a full string section with 9 violins, 3 violas, 2 cellos, and a contrabass. It's a bit crowded. Now, we could go through every single one of those parts and yeah, we're gonna do that, I can't help myself, but I actually think the best way to explain the wall of sound is by zooming in on what has to be ABBA's greatest weapon. The vocals. Like many of the band's biggest hits, Dancing Queen features a sort of dual lead, with the entire thing sung together by Agnetha Fältskog and Frida Lyngstad. In the choruses, they sing in harmony, "You can dance, you can die." But for the verse, they drop into unison. Friday night and the lights are low. And you could argue that makes the second voice unnecessary. After all, it's not adding anything new harmonically, melodically, or rhythmically. But that argument ignores perhaps the most primal form of musical information: timbre, the character and quality of the sound itself. And specifically, it ignores the idea at the very heart of the wall of sound: blending. You've got so many instruments that in order to sound cohesive, you have to start doubling parts, tripling them, combining a bunch of different instruments all playing basically the same thing. As you build those layers, they start fusing together into one massively complex timbral stack, a studio full of sounds merged into a single impossible instrument. And on a smaller scale, the same thing happens here. The reason you have Agnetha and Frida singing together in unison is that it sounds different than just Frida or just Agnetha. But this isn't two random singers. Every human voice is different, and these two are no exception, but through a little luck and a lot of talent and practice, Agnetha and Frida's voices developed a particular rapport, a particular resonance that makes them especially compatible as singing partners. And to understand what exactly each one brings to that partnership, we need to know what they sound like on their own. Let's start with Agnetha. Her voice is bright, piercing, captivating. It cuts brilliantly through the crowded mix and demands your attention. On the other hand, Frida's voice is smooth and sultry, with a slightly lower range and a tone that carries a rich, robust warmth. Where Agnetha commands you to listen, Frida invites you to. And together, you get the best of both worlds. The unison line combines Agnetha's stopping power with Frida's richness and warmth for a voice that sounds both powerful and intimate. And you can even hear how they shift in emphasis as they move between different ranges. The high notes are Agnetha's domain. Anybody could be that guy. marrying the natural brightness and belting power of her upper register with a little color and roughness from Frida working hard to follow her up. But the low notes,
"You come to look for a king,"
belong to the richness and depth of Frida's chest voice, supported by the airiness of Agnetha just barely starting to bottom out. But of course, two great singers, even two incredibly compatible ones, does not a perfect blend make. To really take this over the top, you need production techniques. And there's a lot of those here. Michael Tretow knew his stuff, but to keep things simple, I'll stick to three. The first has to do with the physical studio. Instead of the now common technique of recording the lead vocal first, then overdubbing the other voices later, Agnetha and Frida recorded in the booth together, face to face. And this was partly practical. Back then, when everything had to run through a mixing board, studios were limited to a maximum of 24 tracks. ABBA liked to record parts individually as much as possible in order to get a clean mix at the end, so having everything on one vocal track gave you room to squeeze in another synth. But it also helped with performance. Standing face to face meant they could see and adapt to each other in real time, making tiny little micro adjustments to their phrasing in order to achieve an incredibly precise fit between their two parts. The second technique is simple. These vocals are drenched in reverb. And not just artificial reverb. Tretow also liked to record ABBA's singers standing kind of far from the mics in a large room, so they bleed into each other's parts and absorb the resonant frequencies of the space. This has the same benefit reverb always has, replacing the sterile recording environment with something more exciting and alive. But in this case, it also serves as a bit of a catalyst, rounding out any of the subtle differences that exist between the two singers in order to bring them even closer to complete synchronicity. And third, we have varispeed, or time stretching. But I want to be clear on how this is used. There's a well-known technique where you record at a slower tempo, then speed it up in post. Not only does that let you reach higher notes than your singer could actually produce, it also brightens the tone and it tightens the rhythm, taking any small differences and shrinking them beyond the point where they're noticeable. While I was researching, I found some people saying ABBA did that here, which could explain how the two singers were able to sound so locked in, but I don't think that's true. There's archival footage of the recording session, and as far as I can tell, it's the same tempo as the final release. The time stretch here is a lot more subtle, used for atmosphere and decoration. This is a technique Tretow actually helped pioneer. He loved overdubbing the same track over and over on top of itself to beef up the sound, and he found that if, while doing that, he varied the speed ever so slightly, the tracks would drift in and out of phase with each other, giving the music a mysterious shimmering layer, like you're looking at it through clouded glass. He did that on a lot of ABBA songs, with both instruments and vocals, and I'm pretty sure he's doing it here, at least in the chorus. The verses I'm less sure about, but I believe I hear it there too. Feel free to yell at me in the comments if I'm wrong. And that brings us back to the wall of sound, because most of what I just said about blending applies just as much to the instruments too. Like, take the iconic opening riff. You might be wondering which instrument plays that, and the answer is yes. This melody is doubled by the vocals, violins, some sort of flute synth, and I think one of the guitars too, but those are pretty buried in the mix, so I'm not sure. Each instrument lends its own unique timbre, and the production carefully balances them into a single unified sound that seems to be coming from everywhere all at once. Depending on how you choose to listen, you can hear it as a divine chorus of voices, the richest violin tone you've ever heard, or a fascinatingly complex synth, because in a sense, those are all what it is. The mix is also saturated with overdubs and doubles of most of the instruments, to the point where a lot of the individual parts don't come through, at least not directly. Like, again, listening to the song, I'm genuinely not sure what Björn Ulvaeus' guitars are doing. There's an interview with Tretow where he plays some of the stems, so I know there's two guitar tracks. One of them seems to be doubling Benny Andersson's piano. As for the other, in some of the quieter moments, I can hear some muted scratching, but most of the time it's completely absorbed by the surrounding instruments. I suspect if you removed just the guitar, the difference would be noticeable, but I'm not sure it would be describable. The song wouldn't seem to have lost any specific thing, it would just feel a little flat, a little dull, a little empty. And that's the thing about the wall of sound. When people hear that name, they often assume it's about being as loud as possible, but it's not. It's about cohesion. After all, a wall isn't just bricks. You also need cement. And the other signature part of the wall of sound is just constant riffs and fills. Every time there's a tiny break in the melody, someone swoops in to fill that gap. That could be the rising string line in the middle of the chorus, this percussive figure at the end, or the synth arpeggio in the verse. But more often than not, it's Benny playing this high descending chord figure on the piano. These do remind me of the sorts of improvised licks you might hear in psychedelic rock. There must be some kind of way out of here. But they fill a slightly different role. While a guitarist like Jimi Hendrix uses short blues licks as punctuation, ABBA's fills are more like a bridge. They're there to ensure that the energy remains constant. At any given moment, someone's doing something interesting. And we can see that in the sorts of fills they choose. Each one provides some sort of tension, pointing your ear forward to a resolution that coincides with the melody's return. Sometimes that's done with pitch, like the violin rocketing up or the piano gracefully sliding down, but it can also be rhythmic. The percussive figure uses aggressive syncopation to pull you in, and the synth line is just so dense and disorienting that you find yourself desperate for any sort of held note. Having a good variety of techniques and fills is essential so that no one approach starts to feel repetitive and thus boring. The piano fill is the most common, but it's spaced out well enough that every time it comes back, it feels like a visit from an old friend. And underneath all that sits Roger Palm's drums. Or, okay, one last wall of sound thing. You may have noticed more than just a drum kit in that clip. Like they say in the lyrics, there's also a tambourine played by Malando Gassama. I wonder if that's why it's there. Like, they obviously wanted more percussion to fill the mix, but would they have used a different instrument if tambourine didn't happen to rhyme with queen? I don't know. Probably not. ABBA typically did the arrangements before they wrote lyrics, but still. Makes you think. Anyway, the tambourine is a space filler, adding shimmer and depth to the percussion layer, almost like a particularly jangly hi-hat. The looseness of the instrument also makes the 16th notes feel a bit swung, adding some hidden nuance to the time feel. And the drums themselves show another major influence from the US. Disco. 1975 was nearing the height of the disco scene, and its infectious dance rhythms were spreading into almost every genre of popular music. And Palm is playing a near-perfect prototype of a disco drum beat. The two most iconic parts of this sound are the four-on-the-floor kick, playing on every beat to keep that pounding groove, and open hi-hat splashes on the offbeats for a bright syncopated bounce, both of which form the backbone of Palm's pattern. He varies the openness of the cymbals in different sections and occasionally plays this little snare fill. But other than that, this rock-solid beat is what he plays for the entire song. Which, again, is pretty typical of disco. Dancing to a song requires knowing what's coming next, so strong, consistent patterns like this provide the foundation you need to really cut loose. Which leaves us with the harmony. And Dancing Queen is interesting because it features something that's become kind of a rarity in 12-tone videos, an actual linear chord progression. I know all the other music theory YouTubers love talking about wild jazz chords and wacky modulations, but so much of the music I love and the music I look at on this channel is based on riffs and chord loops, which have their own kinds of harmonic logic. But this isn't some dusty old chord theory we're looking at. In Europop, things like timbre, melody, and rhythm are far more important than the harmony, which raises a fascinating question. How do you write a good chord progression when the chords don't matter? Let's take a look. The song's in A major, and there's three main sections we have to consider: the intro, the chorus, and the verse. Let's start with the intro. That's what those are for. This is actually also the progression for the first half of the chorus, but I'm calling it the intro to keep the two parts separate. You'll see why. Anyway, this section is built on the song's most important harmonic gesture, a vamp between the 1 chord and the 4. It's simple and effective, giving it a sort of rocking motion as it slides between tension and release without ever building up enough of either for a true resolution. The music sounds like it's pacing back and forth, waiting for the chance to really begin. Or perhaps more appropriately for a song about dancing, it's waiting for the chorus to hit. And that effect is amplified by the bass. Instead of following the harmony, Rutger Gunnarsson plays the same A under both chords. This puts the D chord in second inversion, which just means the bass note is the fifth of the chord, not the root. And we can still hear it as a 1/4 vamp, but the inversion means we can also hear it as something else. A double suspension. Suspended chords are an easy way to add a sense of motion to otherwise static harmony. Most commonly, that involves taking the third of the chord, rising it up to the fourth, then dropping back. And we can hear that exact contour of C sharp, D, C sharp in the held notes of the intro melody. A double suspension takes that one step further, accentuating the movement between 3 and 4 with a parallel line between the fifth of the chord and the sixth. Doing both lines at once means this middle voicing contains all the notes of D major, but they function in relation to the chord root A. And this is always there in a 1/4 vamp. The notes of the 4 chord sit above the notes of the 1, and the voice leading that creates is what gives that vamp its unique character. But putting the D chord in second inversion highlights that specific part of the harmonic motion, drawing your ear away from chord functions and toward the internal melodies those chords create. This figure plays for most of the intro, but at the end we suddenly get a huge burst of motion. And here, the relationship between the chords and the bass gets even more complicated. In the bass, Gunnarsson again opts for a very simple part, walking down from the root of the key to the fifth, E, in order to set up a resolution for the transition. But while the bass is creating motion melodically, the chords continue to do it harmonically, dancing around the 1, 4, and 5 chords before doing what looks like a blues-inspired resolution to A before the transition. On paper, these look completely unrelated, but of course that's not how they're heard, so let's look at what Gunnarsson's bass does to the chords above it. We've got 4 different kinds of relationships. The first one's easy. This A chord in the harmony is played over an A in the bass, so it's A. The 2 chords after it aren't much harder. In both cases, the bass puts them in first inversion, playing the third of the chord, which doesn't tend to disrupt the chord's function. It's just allowing the bass to play a smoother line, which, if I had to guess, is probably how that weird blues cadence came about. I assume they wrote the bass line first, then just grabbed some simple chords that happened to fit over it. The harmonic behavior is secondary to the shape of the walkdown. That leaves us with 2 more chords to explain, so let's go back to the start of the phrase. Here, we've got an A in the bass with E major above it. A isn't a chord tone in E, so this isn't an inversion, it's just a dissonant voicing. Typically, when you see a bass note that's not in the chord, your ears will resolve the confusion by treating the bass as the root anyway, which makes this another kind of double suspension. Where D major sits above the notes of A, E major sits below them. Taken all together, E over A can also spell A major 7 sus2, with the G sharp and B wanting to resolve upward to A and C sharp, which is exactly what happens. So that's 1 chord down. The last chord of the section flips this with E in the bass and A major in the chords. This is another second inversion, and we should be used to this by now. It's a double suspension trying to resolve to E major, which it does as we move into the chorus progression. And there's a kind of poetry to this. When we looked at each part on its own, the bass ended on a half cadence that wanted to resolve, while the chords settled into a full cadence that was happy to sit where it was. But together, those roles are reversed. The dissonance of the chords against the bass overrides those individual functions, making the directional bass part feel stable and the satisfied harmony restless. And maybe I could have just started there, but I think it's really interesting that this natural tension arises from 2 lines subverting each other, and it helps explain why the start of the chorus section feels like such a drastic departure. My ears are juggling multiple conflicting expectations, and the resolution to E feels both wrong and right. Which brings us to the chorus progression, and the reason I wanted to separate these 2 parts is that the second is completely different. And not just different chords, it uses different harmonic logic. There's barely any inversions here. Instead, this progression is dominated by borrowed chords and secondary functions. 6 of these chords belong in A major, and if we just look at those, we see a reasonably clear story. We start on the 5 chord, which implies this is some sort of bridge. Despite the resolution from the end of the last phrase, this E chord is not resolved. It's one of the least stable chords in the key, pointing forward toward 1, so starting with it starts us on unstable footing, embarking on a journey that eventually leads back home. Hopefully. But instead of A, we get F sharp minor. This is what's called a deceptive resolution, a sort of harmonic fake-out, providing a satisfying resolution that still feels incomplete. It's a way of continuing the momentum of the dominant chord without holding all of its tension, so the section can progress without reaching a premature conclusion. From there, it turns around and sets up a real resolution, going to 4 and then eventually 1, but the chord in between is kind of interesting. Typically, you might expect a 5 chord here, but instead we get B minor 7. That might seem weird, but I think it makes more sense if you understand that Europop and disco are, first and foremost, melodic styles. Or really, they're timbre styles more than anything, but my point is that melody takes precedence over harmony. This chorus uses a pretty typical AABA form, which means the first line,
Dancing queen, young and sweet, only 17.
and the last one,
See that girl, watch that scene, digging the dancing queen.
are basically the same. But since the first line was written over that 1/4 vamp, it spends a lot of time on A, a note that really doesn't fit over E major. Despite this final statement having a different progression, it still needs to respect that A, nudging us into a slightly less aggressive resolution by leaning on dissonant chords that still contain the root. The motion of the chords is interesting, but the specific functions are less important than the need to support the melody. But this story is complicated slightly by the 2 chords we skipped. These are both secondary dominants, that is, dominant 7 chords borrowed from another key to temporarily point your ear in a different direction. That's easy to hear in the first one, where C sharp 7 is the 5 chord in F sharp, so it naturally wants to resolve to F sharp minor. The more interesting one, though, is B7. This is the 5 chord in E, but it resolves to D. And it does feel resolved, so why? Well, this is where I reach again for a melodic explanation. The B chord is the only inversion in the section, and the D sharp in the bass gives us a nice half-step slide on the bottom. And on top, there's this Mixolydian string line rocketing up that ignores the harmony, resolving instead to E like we'd expect. In the 2 most extreme registers, we have 2 different melodic lines that both tell us this should work. Nothing happening in the middle is gonna overpower those indicators. Which leaves us with the verse progression. This borrows ideas from both of the others. It starts with the same 1/4 vamp yet again, and then, in the back half, it shifts to repeatedly emphasizing that deceptive resolution from E to F sharp. There's even a little transition F sharp in the middle, replacing the second D chord to launch us into the more minor-sounding conclusion. And the darkness of those minor chords coincides with the vocal melody dipping down to its lowest point,
You come to look for a king.
giving the lyrics an almost sinister tone that is, on the surface, pretty surprising. This is a song about how dancing is a fun thing to do. Why are we getting spooky? I mean, you could read a story in this. Maybe the more ominous endings are a subtle commentary on the way society exploits young people, especially young women, in spaces that should be innocent and carefree. It could even be about the specific abuses enabled by the drug-heavy dance scenes this music was made for. And yeah, that reading is there if you want it, but it feels like a reach. To me, these darker sections are less about shaping a narrative and more about controlling energy. Most styles of Western music are built in some way around cycles of tension and release. Traditionally, people who say that usually mean harmony with 5 chords resolving to 1 and whatnot, but that's just one kind of tension. A lot of pop music relies more on timbre, and having Agnetha and Frida drop down to their lowest points, accompanied by a rough, jangly piano that suddenly leaps to the front of the mix, gives us the feeling of a rubber band being pulled back, ready to snap at any moment. Again, the chords aren't really in the driver's seat here. They're weaving around all the other components of the music, trying to be interesting, but more importantly, trying to stay out of the way. The timbre and the melody guide you through this resolution, marking the return to A with a return to bright sounds and high notes. It's really effective. And that's pretty much it. Or, I mean, It's not. That's the problem with analyzing a wall of sound. There's always more layers to pull apart. Like, this song has a gorgeous string arrangement by Sven Olof Waldorf that could be a whole video on its own if I could only find the stems, but I do think that's a bit of a trap. Because what makes Dancing Queen sound so good isn't any of the parts, it's all of the parts. The cohesion is the magic. Each line is subtly crafted to occupy its own unique space, and those spaces combine to surround and envelop you in beautiful, glorious sound. That's what ABBA does best, and they did it so well here. If you're wondering why this video took so long to come out, it's because I was also working on my next video, which is probably my most ambitious project ever. As you know, I love thinking about chord loops. They're such a huge part of popular music, but they're vastly understudied, so I set out to change that. I've spent the last 6 years developing my own theory of loop-based harmony, and I found it super useful in these sorts of song analyses, but I've never actually backed it up. I've never checked if my model was right, and for good reason. It's a lot of work. To really get a sense of how loops are used in general, I'd have to listen to hundreds of songs from across decades of popular music, transcribe any loops I found, and then run that data through some rigorous analysis to see if the predictions I made hold true. So I did that. It took a long time, but I did it, and now I have a definitive, empirically backed answer for the harmonic vocabulary of 4-chord loops. What is it? You'll have to watch the video to find out, and it's up right now on Patreon. Please do check it out. I'm really proud of this one. Link in the description. And hey, thanks for watching. Thanks to our featured patrons, Susan Jones, Jill Sungard, Howard Levine, Warren Hewitt, Damian Fuller-Sutherland, Neil Moore, Jeff, and Hibia Mori. Check out Patreon for a fuller outro, and as always, keep on rockin'.